Morning. It's a long reading this morning, taken from verses from chapters 41 and 42 of Genesis. So, Genesis chapter 41, starting at verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 ears of corn, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other ears of corn sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin ears of corn swallowed up the 7 healthy full ears. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears of corn are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless ears of corn scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." Verse 33. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way." Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the field surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued. "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We're all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them. "You have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Hugh. Sorry, that was a bit of a marathon, wasn't it? So it was quite a long listen. You might want to just have a bit of a wriggle in your seat to wake yourself up. Anyway, so for those of you I don't know, my name's Judith. I'm one of the occasional preachers here. And before I start, I'd also just like to publicly thank my neighbour Janet, who's an Egyptologist and has been ever so generous with her time as I pestered her with more and more questions about Egypt. So, Joseph. We left Joseph last week forgotten in prison. 2 full years have passed and nothing has happened. How hard that must have been. How hard to trust in God's goodness. Sometimes in our lives, we really struggle to see hope in a situation. We struggle to believe that God's goodness could possibly work in a situation. And this story, it encourages us to hold on to trust in God, even if just with the tips of our fingers. Some people say faith is a crutch, something, and usually they mean something not real, something to lean on when you can't cope. And what we've learnt from Joseph's life to date is that leaning on God can hold our weight in very hard times. Many of us can say yes to that from our own experience. But is faith just for hard times? What does faith look like now in times of prosperity? Things are turning around for Joseph. It's amazing. It's one of those wonderful triumph over the odds stories that we really love. Joseph's qualities have come to the attention of Pharaoh. He's been given a big job, a responsible role, and with it has come power and riches. With it has come a well-connected wife, and he's been blessed with 2 sons. Life is good. So can we see God in his life now when all is going well? You know, sometimes when we think about God being at work through people, I think we can fall into the trap of thinking about people who work for the church in some way. Joseph's life now was more akin to being CEO of Sainsbury's than being a vicar or a priest. And yet, we can see God at work and in his life. We can see a life that speaks of God and is God in action. Because Joseph, both privately and publicly, trusts in God's goodness for himself and for others. We see right at the start of this turnaround, at that pivotal point, we see Joseph driving that stake into the ground. I cannot interpret your dreams, but God can. He's telling Pharaoh and Pharaoh's court, my ability to interpret dreams and to be able to advise on what to do, it comes from God. It isn't me. This help that I am bringing is given to you by God. And later, when his sons are born, he follows the custom at the time of choosing names which make a statement. And the statement he wants to give is about God's goodness. Giving thanks to God who provides, God who has provided for me in my times of suffering. Joseph trusts God in good times as well as in bad. And trusting in God's goodness doesn't just mean that Joseph receives stuff from God. It means he obeys, bases his life choices on what he knows of God. It places boundaries around what he will do. So he says to his brothers, "You can trust me to do right by you because I fear God." And we can contrast this bedrock of trust in God's goodness through bad times and good with his brother's fearful statement when they're arrested. This is happening to us because God is punishing us. And in fact, as we will see next week, that was part of the story, but only a part. In reality, God is providing for them. Without security in God's love and goodness, it's all too easy, isn't it, to respond in this way when things go wrong. People often don't express it in terms of God. They might say, "Fate is against me," or "the universe is against me," or "I must have done something bad in a past life to deserve this." And as Christians, we sometimes find it hard to trust God. I find it especially hard to trust God to work in the lives of the people I love. I find it hard to trust God for my children. But as we see in this passage, God's goodness is real and can be trusted even in the most difficult of situations. So what did trusting God's goodness look like in Joseph's life in this time of busyness and prosperity? What did it make possible? I noticed 3 themes. His life was a practical blessing to others. He lived wisely, and it wasn't easy. Let's start with being a blessing. Joseph was a blessing to people who were not like him. Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and set out a plan for what to do. And through his work, thousands of people were saved from starvation. And I want to linger on this a little bit. Because Genesis is the family story of Abraham and his descendants, and it's a fantastic faith-building story of how God's promise to Abraham was worked out through the generations, we can easily miss the inclusive message here. Most of the people benefiting from the way that God was using Joseph were Egyptians. Through Joseph, God was blessing and providing for the people where Joseph lived. People who had a completely different religious worldview. Egypt was a rich and powerful country with a really impressive cultural and political developed life, very different from the tribes around, who were largely nomadic. And all of this edifice was built on grain, which was produced in the fertile Nile Delta. Every year, the Nile flooded, the waters receded, the crops were sown, were harvested before the flood season again. Egypt was the breadbasket of the region. But this was fragile. If the floods were too much, too little, too soon, or too late, the harvest wasn't good. And there was sometimes famine. And in Egypt's history, times of famine had led to weakness and being overrun and ruled by outsiders. Power had collapsed. So the Egyptians lived with risk and uncertainty. And dreams and omens were seen as important at that time all over the ancient world as a way of coping with this uncertainty. If you're forewarned of disaster, you might be able to do something about it. People expected to hear from their gods in this way. And so God, the true one God of the universe, spoke in the way that they were listening. The Egyptians had a concept of, I won't say it right, I'm sure, but ma'at, the rightness of things. The sun coming up in the morning and going down at the end of the day is ma'at, how things should be. The Nile flooding at just the right time for the crops was ma'at. There was a god of ma'at, and also Pharaoh was responsible for maintaining ma'at so that his people, the Egyptians, would be protected and fed. If there was famine, Pharaoh had failed. He had not met his purpose, and his authority melted away. But of course, Pharaoh didn't have the power to do this. He himself was as much at the mercy of the elements as the least in his kingdom. No wonder he and his court were very disturbed by dreams of hungry cattle emerging from the Nile. He couldn't interpret the dream, and he didn't know what to do. So when Joseph says, this interpretation is from God, he is saying to Pharaoh, you can't control nature. You can't prevent famine. But there is help. There is a God whose goodness can help you. Right from the beginning of the story of God and humankind, we see this message of inclusion, of God's desire to bless all. And we ourselves and the people around us are often struggling with things which are too big for us. And we too have a message that we can trust and that we can express through both words and actions, a message that there is help and hope. There is a God of love and goodness who can help us, whoever we are, whatever our difficulty. And Joseph was a blessing to those who didn't deserve it. And that's important too to notice, isn't it? We see his practical compassion to his brothers. He would have known that each one represented many hungry people, wives, children, servants. In allowing all but Simeon to return with grain, he was enabling these people to survive. And of course, the trouble in prolonged famine is that you buy grain and then your money runs out, and so then you starve. So in returning their money, presumably from his own wealth, he was making a more long-term gift and solution. Showing kindness to people who have wronged you is what forgiveness looks like. Remember Jesus' instruction to us that we should love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. So Joseph, through his words and through doing his job well, was a source of blessing to many. What about us? There's a challenge here for us, our families, our workplaces, our friendship groups, our sports teams, all the places where we meet people. They should be blessed because of us. They should be blessed through how we speak and what we do. The second theme I noticed was that Joseph's trust in God's goodness helped him to live wisely. Joseph was not naive. He lived wisely through doing his job well, so that the grain was stored and distributed, and not just anyhow, but travelling throughout the land and organising stores in each city meant it was spread fairly around the country. And he showed wisdom with his mercy and compassion when his brothers arrived. Notice he didn't immediately seek reconciliation. Yes, Following God meant kindness rather than revenge. But it didn't mean blindly leaping in. Forgiveness does not necessarily mean continuing a relationship. Joseph needed to know whether he could trust his brothers. And maybe his brothers were yet to fully accept their need of forgiveness. He must also have been aware that the jealousy and hatred he had suffered from could most likely have spread to his younger brother Benjamin, and he probably really wanted Benjamin in Egypt so he could protect him. And of course, when he saw his brothers bowing down to him, he would have remembered his boyhood dream. And that dream would have told him that all of his brothers and his parents needed to come to Egypt. So he proceeded with caution and patience. It must have been hard saying nothing and sending his brothers off. From his experience of them, it was very possible they would never come back. Living wisely meant blessing his brothers and also being cautious, trusting in God, not rushing ahead, trying to fix things himself. And we also see him dealing wisely with a conflict of interests. Just by being there in Egypt, his brothers created a bit of a tricky situation for Joseph, and potentially a bit of a dilemma between loyalty to his new country and loyalty to his family. They were outsiders, and they were also his family. The brothers not recognizing Joseph might seem like one of those things that happens in plays that always makes me snort and go, oh, really? But actually, it's quite plausible. It had been about 20 years since they'd seen him as a teenager. But more than that, the Egyptians had a very different style. They were unusual in that they were clean-shaven, they wore different kinds of clothing, they usually wore white. That little bit of detail about Joseph shaving, we know that he dressed as an Egyptian. So he looked like an Egyptian. He was doing the job of an Egyptian. So they would have assumed that he was an Egyptian powerful man, a stranger. And he sort of was an Egyptian now. He'd lived there by the time his brothers arrived, about 20 years. He spoke the language, he had an Egyptian wife and family, an Egyptian name, he had a big job, and he owed his loyalty to Pharaoh, and he had a responsibility towards the people at a time of emergency. But he wasn't an Egyptian, he was an outsider. He knew that these men weren't spies, or most likely weren't spies, but he could also see that that is how it looked, and how easily that suspicion could become a reminder. Joseph isn't one of us. Suspicion and mistrust could really undermine Joseph, and he knew how quickly it could all fall apart, especially in twitchy times when the harvests were failing. He'd already been thrown into prison without trial once and festered there for years. So he needed to be seen to be checking them out. He needed to visibly act as an Egyptian. This perhaps helps us to understand his harsh accusation of spying. And these kinds of conflicts of loyalty can be very real for us too. Joseph's example encourages us to put our trust in God and to seek God's wisdom to negotiate the trickiness of life. Which brings me to my final theme. None of this was easy. I've been wondering, I wonder what future Joseph had dreamt about and longed for as a young man. I'd guess in his early years in Egypt, it would have been something along the lines of getting away, getting free from working for Potiphar, and getting enough money to go home and pick up his old life, returning perhaps as a bit of a hero that would really be won over his brothers. He would have wanted to go home. He would have wanted to enjoy the life he'd been looking forward to. But that wasn't happening. And he must have had to struggle to come to terms with accepting this is my life now. And it may not be my first choice life, but it isn't a second best life. God has put me here. I don't understand it, but I do trust in God's goodness. We can see this struggle and letting go in the naming of his first child, Manasseh, which means forget. And he explained, because God has made me forget my hardships and made me forget my family home. God has helped me to let go of the past and my expectations. And of course, many of us and many of our friends are living lives which in some ways don't match our dreams or expectations. Placing our trust in God's goodness can help us to come to terms with this, to let go of the struggle bit by bit, so that we can receive God's good future and God's goodness today. Joseph had a much better life now, but it wasn't home. And when I was preparing for today, it really reminded me and put on my heart to pray for people living far from home, for migrants and refugees, for our mission partners, and for many others too who have travelled and are far from home. And wasn't that film from Tear Fund that we saw so inspiring and encouraging? And we're very aware that not only in Afghanistan, but particularly there at the moment, there are many people desperately fleeing their homes. And it really mattered that Joseph wasn't Egyptian. It made him vulnerable. Egyptian society was very self-sufficient. Yes, they mixed through trade, but they didn't tend to settle elsewhere or conquer other tribes because they didn't need to. All the wealth was in Egypt. In fact, there was no word in their language for foreigner. There was person, meaning Egyptian, or non-person. They didn't really have a concept of person like me who happened to be born somewhere else. The idea of universal humanity and universal human rights just is a more recent way of looking at things. So Joseph must always have been aware of not being Egyptian and how vulnerable, how much of an outsider that made him. And when he spoke of God, it drew attention to his otherness and difference. And don't we sometimes feel vulnerable speaking about faith? We worry that people will somehow think we're different, will put us in the God box, the religious box, and that it will cut us off in some way from people. And that can make us feel really vulnerable and be an obstacle to speaking. Well, Joseph must have felt like that too. And his example encourages us to trust in God's goodness and to speak openly about Jesus. And such very distressing, traumatic things had happened in Joseph's life. We can only imagine the feelings stirred up when his brothers arrived. No wonder he took time out to weep. We sometimes imagine that life is supposed to be smooth and comfortable for Christians, but it really isn't. The promise we can hold on to is that Jesus is always with us. We never need to deal with anything alone. As thousands of years after Joseph, Paul wrote to the Christians in Philippi, "Don't worry about anything, but in all your prayers, ask God for what you need, always asking him with a thankful heart. And God's peace, which is far beyond human understanding, will keep your hearts and minds safe in union with Christ Jesus. And my God will meet all your needs in Christ Jesus." So Joseph's life was a bit of a roller coaster, and today we've been looking at an upturn. And through both the bad and the good, Joseph put his trust in God's goodness. And as a result, he was a blessing in the situation he found himself in. He was a blessing through his actions and because his life pointed to God's goodness. So what about the week ahead? Some of us may be dealing with difficult dilemmas, maybe feeling far from home in some way, or that this is not our first choice life. All of us will have the opportunity to be a blessing. Let's place our trust in the goodness of God and be a blessing this week through how we live and how we speak.